Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for coming forward here today and delivering your testimony. And I know that sometimes reliving these things is a heavy burden, and I'm always impressed that when we have witnesses that can deliver that message from the head and the heart, from the direct experience. Listening to the gentleman from Georgia, and some of this doesn't quite fit up with my worldview. You might not be surprised to learn. But I noticed that, Ms. Smith, he didn't ask you your position on the death penalty, so I'd give you an opportunity to tell us.
I'm against the death penalty.
You're opposed to the death penalty?
Yes, I am.
Was your earlier testimony, though, that the dismemberment of babies is not necessarily an inhumane way for those babies to die?
You're using the word baby. My definition of baby is a baby that is born. So if you're talking about fetuses,
but
talking about
you acknowledge that
abortion,
testimony, even though
I support D&E abortions.
And you would not assert that it's inhumane to dismember this unborn baby.
I'm sorry, say it again.
You would not assert that it's inhumane to dismember an unborn baby.
I would not say it that way. I would say it's not inhumane to perform a D&E abortion on a pre-viable fetus.
A pre-viable fetus would be an unborn baby, would they not? We're back to that. Excuse me. I'll just stop this exchange because you went through this with Chairman Franks, and I think we've resolved that. You have your language and you're sticking to it. And if anybody uses any other kind of term that describes it any differently, you would object to that.
I just want to know what you mean by it.
So let me ask you another question then, since we've established where you are on this with many years of practice, and that is, do you recall when it hit the news a few years ago that Red China, the Chinese, would bring criminals up on capital charges, and through due process, the Red Chinese due process, convict them of a capital crime, sentence them to execution, and on their way to execution, harvest their organs and use those organs in medical practices in China? Do you recall that?
No.
Well, it happened.
I believe you, but I was not.
It does happen, and I recall that America was appalled by the idea that a heartless, barbaric civilization like the Red Chinese would sentence someone to death under their version of due process, roll them through the operating room on the gurney and harvest their organs, their kidneys, their hearts, their livers, their pancreas, whatever it is that they thought they could utilize at the time. And that was they'll say, the harvest of the execution. We were appalled at the immorality of executing someone and harvesting their organs. Does that appall you, Ms. Smith?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I thought it might, and it appalls me. But I wonder what the Chinese might think of the United States of America to be borrowing $500 million from the Chinese, send that money over to Planned Parenthood, that money that gets flowed through their system ends up being utilized however Planned Parenthood decides, but we're helping to fund an organization that is dismembering babies, harvesting their organs, and selling those organs on the market, and we heard them negotiating for the price on the market, along with the methodologies that would be used in order to harvest more organs. Now I wonder, and I'd ask you, what do you think the Chinese think of us if we are critical of them for harvesting organs from someone who has gone through due process and sentenced to death?
I have no idea what the Chinese think of us, but I do think that the Supreme Court got it right when it recognized that the state has an interest in the developing and potential life of the fetus.
I would agree with that, and my clock is running, so I appreciate you saying so. And I turn to Mr. Bopp and ask you that same question, Mr. Bopp. Would you care to have you heard of the practice in China of harvesting organs? Have you philosophically compared the two methodologies and what the Chinese might think of us?
You know, yes, I'm familiar with those allegations, and of course the Chinese are using the same utilitarian calculus that the abortion advocates here are using to justify the abuses that have been documented regarding a collection of fetal tissue. Such as Professor Smith, well, the person's not viable, so therefore you can kill it at will. Well, the prisoner convicted of a capital punishment on the way to being executed is clearly not viable, and viable means the ability to long-term survival. So in their calculus, the way they treat human beings or don't respect human beings, then it would be perfectly appropriate to do what the Chinese are doing.
If I could just tie this loop together, Mr. Chairman, is this that the United States is at least virtually borrowing $500 million from China and funneling that money through to Planned Parenthood. The fungible budget of Planned Parenthood, I will say, is being used to commit abortions that are dismembering babies and selling their organs on the open market by the evidence we've seen before our very eyes. I don't need an investigation to understand what's going on here. I hold those truths to be self-evident when I saw the video. And so this Congress, we're informing the public by this hearing, but the Justice Department needs to investigate and act. And if they see what I've seen by watching the videos, I believe that brings about prosecutions and eventually convictions. And I call upon the Justice Department, do your job. You've testified here before this committee that you're an independent branch of the government that is not directed by the President. The President stood on the floor of the Illinois State Senate and said a woman who wants an abortion has a right to a dead baby. I'm saying there's nobody in this United States of America that should be compelled to pay taxes that are going to pay the interest on the debt to China so that something like this can't happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.